with us this morning, political commentators, both and Peter's a political strategist as well. Tell us, Theo, how important Keir Starmer is at the moment.
Because he has agreed to and committed to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Now what we see, and this is centrepiece for our discussions today.
Adamant that they would be prepared to put peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine should it be deemed necessary, but of course they want that backstop, that security backstop from the United States. But in the wider picture
is that Putin is the one trying to delay. And in a sense, and you all know this, if Putin is serious about peace, it's very simple.
3 days ago, Trump proposes a ceasefire deal. 2 days ago, Putin rejects it outright. Yesterday, Starmer assembles 25 world leaders to form what he calls a coalition of the willing. Today, military planners discuss potential troop deployments near Russian borders. This rapid escalation isn't happening in a vacuum. Putin demands Ukraine abandon NATO aspirations and surrender occupied territories, terms Starmer calls unacceptable. Meanwhile, Zelensky reports Russian forces capturing new territory during these so-called peace discussions. We're tracking each development in this dangerous diplomatic chess match that could determine whether we're headed toward peace or expanded conflict. When Donald Trump announced he was getting pretty good vibes out of Russia regarding a potential ceasefire, the diplomatic world held its breath. European capitals buzzed with cautious optimism that Trump's unorthodox approach might succeed where traditional diplomacy had failed. But Putin had other plans that reveal much about his true intentions in this conflict. Within just 48 hours, Putin's response landed like a diplomatic hand grenade. His conditions weren't merely tough, they were deliberately impossible. Ukraine would need to abandon any NATO aspirations and surrender control of territories Russia currently occupies. As Keir Starmer bluntly put it, these demands were completely unacceptable and designed for rejection rather than negotiation. This wasn't Putin simply being stubborn. The timing and nature of his response expose a calculated strategy. While peace talks were supposedly underway,
of where we find ourselves right now, the Prime Minister's statement says it all. The ball is in Putin's court. He needs to decide to come to the table and negotiate with primarily Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine.
He has to stop his barbaric attacks on Ukraine and agree to a ceasefire. And the world is watching. And my feeling is that sooner or later he's going to have to come.
Yes, Keir Starmer is trying to cement his position amongst European leaders, but the real negotiations, the ones that really matter,
to the table and engage in serious discussion. But, and this is a big but for us this morning in our meeting, we can't sit back.
Russian forces were actively advancing and recapturing key areas across the front line. President Zelensky wasn't fooled, accusing Putin of cynically extending negotiations while launching fresh attacks. The pattern is clear. Putin uses diplomatic overtures as cover for military maneuvers. Starmer's assessment cuts through the diplomatic niceties. His intelligence briefings have convinced him that Putin is playing games, engaging in ceasefire talks not to achieve peace, but to create breathing room for his military. The Kremlin's dismissive response to Trump's proposal demonstrates they aren't serious about ending hostilities under any reasonable terms. The stakes couldn't be higher. Trump himself warned that the failure of these peace talks could lead to World War III, a conflict like no other given the nuclear arsenals involved. His stark language underscores the gravity of Putin's rejection and the dangerous path ahead. The critical question diplomatic and military analysts are now grappling with: was Putin ever genuinely interested in peace? The evidence suggests not. His actions during the supposed negotiation period, continuing military operations, imposing impossible conditions, refusing to engage in good faith, point to a leader buying time rather than seeking resolution. The diplomatic landscape has fundamentally shifted. Western leaders, who might have hoped for a negotiated settlement, are now preparing for potential escalation. Starmer's reaction has been particularly telling, pivoting from cautious optimism pragmatism to organizing what he calls a coalition of the willing. This represents a seismic shift in approach, from hopeful diplomacy to coordinated pressure. While diplomats exchange pleasantries in public forums, military planners from 25 nations are quietly gathering in London to draw up something Putin fears more than sanctions: detailed plans for Western forces on land, at sea, and in the sky, surrounding Russian positions. This coalition of the willing isn't just another diplomatic talking shop. It represents potentially the most significant military realignment.
Donald Trump, his team in the US administration, and of course Moscow and Putin's team representing Russian interests.
And simply wait for that to happen. We have to keep pushing ahead, pushing forward, and preparing for peace, and a peace that will be secure and that will last.
What Theo said, that Starmer is positioning himself amongst European leaders, but in reality, what is he actually achieving? This coalition of the willing, it doesn't seem to be having a lot of willing people.
And I think that means strengthening Ukraine so they can defend themselves, and strengthening, obviously, in terms of military capability, in terms of funding, in terms of the provision.
In Europe, since NATO's expansion eastward, Starmer's emergency video conference with leaders from Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ukraine, the EU Commission, and NATO marks a dramatic escalation in Western resolve. Far from mere political theatre, this virtual summit established concrete military planning frameworks with immediate practical implications. What makes this coalition particularly formidable is its dual-track approach. On one hand, it's preparing peacekeeping forces that could deploy rapidly if negotiations ever progress. Simultaneously, it's ramping up military and economic pressure on Russia to force Putin back to the negotiating table on more favorable terms. Robust and credible security arrangements are the best way to ensure that any deal ends in a lasting peace, Starmer declared during the summit. This seemingly diplomatic statement masks a more aggressive reality. The coalition intends to position international forces in strategic locations to monitor Russia's compliance with any potential agreement. Such arrangements would effectively place Western military assets in positions to directly observe and potentially counter any Russian violations. The economic component of Starmer's strategy is equally bold. He's pledged to strain every sinew to intensify economic pressure if negotiations falter. Behind closed doors, coalition members are actively discussing the seizure of frozen Russian assets, a step that Putin himself has previously labeled an act of war. This willingness to push economic confrontation to unprecedented levels signals a significant hardening of Western resolve. But Starmer's coalition isn't without internal challenges. Nations like Hungary and Slovakia have expressed clear reservations about military involvement, reflecting the difficult balancing act needed to maintain unity among 25 different countries.
France and ourselves willing to put boots on the ground, openly stating that. I mean, it's somewhat of a kick in the teeth for Starmer in terms of his actual ability to deliver on something.
Secondly, being prepared to defend any deal ourselves through a coalition of the willing. We've begun that process, and this morning we can take it forward.
I think he's looking like he's important, but let's be real, Donald Trump will just ignore him if necessary. He's somewhat of an irrelevancy to the grander scheme and the grander negotiations that are happening.
And then thirdly, and really importantly, given the developments of the last few days, to keep the pressure on Putin to come to the table. And I think collectively we've got a number of ways that we can do that.
With varying national interests and domestic political constraints, the coalition's effectiveness ultimately depends on maintaining this delicate consensus. What's particularly notable is how quickly this alliance formed in response to Putin's rejection of the ceasefire proposal. Within days, Starmer managed to assemble a multinational coalition prepared to deploy military assets in support of Ukraine's security, a demonstration of diplomatic agility that few expected from the relatively new British Prime Minister. The diplomatic chessboard has reached a critical juncture. With Trump's peace deal now in tatters, we're witnessing a fundamental realignment of Western strategy spearheaded by Starmer's coalition. The crucial moment arrives this week as military planners gather in London on March 20th to transform diplomatic talk into concrete action plans, marking the operational phase of the coalition's strategy following their March 15th 12th virtual summit. Starmer's message to Putin has become increasingly direct: accept an unconditional ceasefire or face escalating consequences. As he pointedly stated, Putin will, sooner or later, need to come to the table. This ultimatum represents a dramatic shift from earlier overtures. The assembled coalition now offers Putin two stark paths: diplomatic resolution or confrontation with a unified front prepared to deploy a full spectrum of pressures. The coming days won't merely determine Ukraine's immediate fate. They'll reshape the European security landscape for years to come. The question hanging over diplomatic capitals isn't just whether peace can be salvaged, but whether the international order itself can withstand the strains of this increasingly volatile standoff.